Things have gotten out of control. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you so much for joining me yet again today. So today, I need your help. And let me explain. I recently saw a video by Kathy from Nerdy Kathy, and she was talking about the 15 series that she is anticipating or excited to read in 2025. And a lot of the series that she is hoping to read are also on my list. So I got to thinking, what series are on my kind of immediate TBR? Some of them have come out this year, some of them have been around for decades, and I made a quick list, and my list contained over 24 series in it. There's no way that I can actually read all of those next year, but I'm going to do my best. So what I've done is I put them into 3 categories: fantasy, sci-fi, and horror, and I'm going to just go through all of the series that I actually hope to read in 2025, knowing that I'm not going to be able to. And I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Have you read these series? Are there series I missed? Are you interested in buddy reading any of these series? I would, any feedback you give me would be helpful because I need to kind of direct myself. Now, some of these series I'm almost definitely going to read, but then a lot of them are on the boundary, and there's so many of them. Who knows which one's I'm going to get to? Let me first start by saying the series that I'm currently in the middle of right now. I think there are 2, I guess maybe 3 series that I'm currently reading right now. I say maybe 3 because one of them is a series by Richard Chismar called the Boogeyman series. And right now there are 2 books in this: Chasing the Boogeyman and Becoming the Boogeyman. And these are faux true crime horror novels, and they're great. I love them. The way the second book ended, there's almost definitely going to be a 3rd book, but he hasn't announced it yet. So that's why that one's a maybe. I don't know when that next book is going to come out. Maybe in 2025, maybe not. So that's a series I'm in the middle of, but I can't do anything else with it right now. Now, there are 2 other series that I'm in the middle of. The first one is the Tyrant Philosopher series by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And so the first book in that is The City of Last Chances, and I just completed this earlier this month. I'm doing a buddy read with Alex from Alex on a Bridge, and I loved this. I thought it was great. The second book in that is called The House of Open Wounds, and I already have plans to buddy read that in January with Alex. And then the third book is Days of Shattered Faith, and I am going to be buddy reading that with Alex in February. That's the plan. So right now I have 2 more books in that series to read. And then the next series that I'm in the middle of right now is, I guess middle is being very generous, but Robin Hobb's The Realm of the Elderling series is a 16-book series, but it's split up into 5 different trilogies, or 4 trilogies and a quadrilogy. So of the first trilogy, I've read the first 2 books so far, and that is The Assassin's Apprentice and The Royal Assassin. So these are the first 2 books in the Farseer trilogy. That's the name of the first trilogy. And so the 3rd book is Assassin's Quest. And you can see the books get chunkier, right? Assassin's Quest is essentially the size of the first 2 put together. But so that is on my immediate TBR. I was supposed to read it in November. Things got out of control. So that is coming up soon. So those are the 3 series I'm in the middle of. Now, here's a list of 24 plus series that I haven't started yet, but I hope to. And I'm just going to go through these really quick. There's so many, I can't spend a lot of time on each. So the first one, following with the Realm of the Elderlings, is the next trilogy in the Realm of the Elderlings, and that is the Live Ship Traders trilogy. So that is these 3 books. As you can see, these are not small books, but so this is the next in the trilogy, the Live Ship Traders, and I hope to read those next year. Those are kind of on the top of my TBR. And then if I do read those and I have time, the 3rd trilogy in the Realm of the Elderling series is called the Tawny Man trilogy, and that's these 3 books. So those are also on my kind of TBR, but not imminent, because I have to get through, it looks like almost 2,000 pages of the Live Ship trilogy before I can get to those. So those are the first 2 of my fantasy trilogies that I'm hoping to get to. Now, the rest of them are not in any real order. I will say the next one is Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson. Now, this is a 10-book epic series that is often compared to like Shakespeare of the fantasy genre, and I really hope to read this. I will say, as much as I want to start this year, I don't think I'm going to, because it is so large in scope and has a very vast cast of characters. I'm going to have a hard time reading any other series while I'm reading that, I believe. So I don't want to start that until probably I finish the Realm of the Elderling series. That's my guess. To go into epic fantasy, I don't know. We'll see. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you think I can read that along with other ones. Let me know. I really do want to read the Malazan Book of the Fallen series, those 10 books. So that is on my list. I don't know if I'm going to get to it this year, but I hope to. Now, moving on, the next series is by Mark Lawrence, and it's called the Library Trilogy. And the Library Trilogy has 3 books. 2 of them are already published. The next one is coming out in April, I think, of 2025. So the first book is The Book That Wouldn't Burn, and the second book is The Book That Broke the World, and the 3rd book is called The Book That Held Her Heart. And the tagline for the series is, A boy has lived his whole life trapped within a vast library, older than empires and larger than cities. A girl has spent hers in a tidy settlement out on the dust, where nightmares stalk and no one goes. The world has never even noticed them. That's about to change. So that sounds exciting. I love books about books. I love books about libraries. And so give me a fantasy trilogy set in a world where there is a library as big as a city, and I'm in. Next on the list is the Second Apocalypse series by R. Scott Baker. Now, this right now has 7 books in the series. There's a trilogy called the Prince of Nothing trilogy, and that is followed by the Aspect Emperor quadrilogy. And originally, this was supposed to be a trilogy with 3 books: the Prince of Nothing, the Aspect Emperor, and the No God. Now, the first book ended up being a trilogy, the second book ended up being a quadrilogy, and nothing has been published regarding the intended third book, No God. So I'm not sure if there's going to be another trilogy coming. He doesn't seem to have said anything in a few years about it, so we'll see. Now, what I do know about this is that it is, again, kind of epic fantasy, and it's very grimdark. It doesn't have a lot of light in it. It doesn't have a lot of compassion or hope. And so it's kind of a downer of a series, or so I've heard. I'm excited to read it. I like grimdark. I have to be in the right mood for it. But so that is next on the list. Following that is the Bloodsworn Saga by John Gwynne. Now, this is the Shadow of the Gods, the Hunger of the Gods, and the Fury of the Gods. This is Norse-inspired mythical high fantasy. The third one just came out, I think, last month, or maybe a few months ago, and I'm very excited to read that. So that's next on the list. Following that is the Adan trilogy by Philip Chase. Now, Philip Chase is on BookTube as the best of fantasy, and I actually had a chance to do a discussion with him and Joanna of Joanna Reads in her Why Read series. And I had heard of this trilogy before I had a chance to do that discussion, but even just speaking with him made me more excited. So I really hope to read that trilogy coming up as well. And that is The Way of Adan, The Prophet of Adan, and The Return to Adan. So going in a little bit different direction, away from kind of epic fantasy or high fantasy, I'm interested in reading the Wicked Years Quartet. So this is the 4 books by Gregory Maguire, the first one being Wicked, which obviously now is made into a musical and now a movie. I think, as everyone knows, this is a retelling of The Wizard of Oz. And I'd already been interested in reading this quadrilogy just a little bit because I like retellings and I like reframing things from different perspectives. And so I was interested in it. And then I heard Troy Troutop really celebrating the first book, Wicked. And so because of that, that kind of pushed me over the edge. So I do hope to read that quadrilogy, the Wicked Years Quartet. Next in my fantasy series that I want to read is the Green Creek Quartet by TJ Klune. And now this is a queer werewolf fantasy series. Wolf Song, Raven Song, Love Song, and Heart Song are the 4 books in it. And I have read Under the Whispering Door, and I also have an arc of a new book coming out in February by him called The Bones Beneath My Skin. And I think right now he's most famous for The House in the Cerulean Sea and its sequel. So I'm really excited to hopefully get a chance to read some queer werewolf fantasy. Like, what can go wrong with that? And then the last fantasy series that I'm hoping to read is by Howe, and it's called The Singing Hill Cycle. And right now there are 5 books in the series. I think there are planned 8 books, but they're all novellas, which is actually really appealing. It is another queer fantasy series, and this one has to do with overthrowing empire and what it means to hold a crown. And I had never heard of this series, but earlier this year, in October, Howe released a novel called City in Glass, and that is a historical fantasy that features angels and demons and kind of this mythic conquest. And I haven't read that yet, but I've heard lots of good reviews for it. So I was looking into what else she has written, and I saw this series come up, and reading the description of it, it sounds really exciting. So that is the last of my fantasy series that I'm looking forward to reading or hoping to read in 2025. So again, the Live Ship Traders trilogy and the Tawny Man trilogy by Robin Hobb, Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson, the Library trilogy by Mark Lawrence, the Second Apocalypse series by R. Scott Baker, the Bloodsworn Saga by John Gwynne, the Adan trilogy by Philip Chase, the Wicked Years Quartet by Gregory Maguire, the Green Creek Quartet by TJ Klune, and the Singing Hill Cycle, which currently has 5 books in it, by Howe. So that's fantasy. Now let's move on to sci-fi. So the first sci-fi series that I really, really, really want to read, and I really think 2025 will be the year I do it, is The Wayfarer's Quartet by Becky Chambers. This starts with The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. Motley Crue in an optimistic sci-fi. Like, what can go wrong? I love everything else of Becky Chambers I've read, and I've wanted to read this for a while. Usually when I read a series, I kind of read them back to back to back. I usually don't let a lot of time sit between books in the series, and so I just hadn't found time to read a quartet of new books, but I'm really hoping to read these. These are going to be on the top of my list, I think. Now, moving on from there is the Children of Time series by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now, as I said, I'm reading his Tyrant Philosopher series right now, which is a fantasy series. The Children of Time is maybe his most famous sci-fi series, or his most celebrated, at least, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. It's another one that's been on my TBR list for a while, so hopefully I'll get to it this year. Moving on from that is the Hyperion Quartet by Dan Simmons. So this starts with Hyperion, then the fall of Hyperion, Endymion, and The Rise of Endymion. Now, I've heard the last two books in the series are not as good as the first two. You know, this is classic sci-fi, especially the first two are really considered giants in the genre, and I like everything else I've read by Dan Simmons so far, so I'm hoping to read those. Moving on, the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. So this trilogy is made up of the fifth season, The Obelisk Gate, and Stone Sky. And this is dystopian sci-fi fantasy, and everyone says the writing is really dense. Many people have a hard time getting through it because the writing doesn't sit with them well, but I really like dense writing, and I've read some other things by N.K. Jemisin, so I'm really hoping to get into this. It's been on my TBR for quite a long time. It won the Hugo, it won the Nebula Award. You know, it's really well praised, and I think for good reason. So that's on the list. Next is The Captives War series by James S.A. Corey, who wrote The Expanse. I loved The Expanse. I read all 9 books in The Expanse. I thought it was great. And the first book is called The Mercy of the Gods. So far, that's the only full-length novel that has been released. There is a novella as well. I imagine the second book in the series is probably going to come out in 2025. At least with The Expanse, they were pretty consistent in putting out a book a year. And so I hope to start that series next year so I can kind of stay on top of it. It's nice to stay on a series as it's being published, as opposed to waiting until you have a backlog of dozens of books to read, which is the case with some of these other series. And that's the case with the next series. The next series I want to read is the original Dune trilogy by Frank Herbert. Now, I read Dune twice. I read it once when I was young, maybe 6th or 7th grade, and I read it again a few years ago. I think before the new movie came out, I read it, and I love it. I think Dune is a great novel. I was never really inspired to read any of the other novels. Now, I believe the first 6 novels were all written by Frank Herbert, and then the ones after that were written maybe by his son. But I've been told the first 6 novels are kind of 2 trilogies. And so there's Dune, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune kind of fit the first trilogy. So I'm hoping to at least read that. And if that kind of excites me and inspires me, maybe I'll consider reading more books in the series. But that first trilogy, at least, I'm hoping to read. I probably won't reread Dune, since I did just read it a few years ago, and I know the plot of it decently well, but I do hope to read the second 2 books in that series. Moving on from there, the Passage trilogy by Justin Cronin. So this is The Passage, The 12, and The City of Mirrors. I recently read, maybe this year or last year, I read The Ferryman by Justin Cronin, and I thought it was great. And I wanted to read the Passage trilogy for a while, and then Alex from Alex Unabridged has more than once said how this is one of his favorite sci-fi series. So that kind of, again, pushed me over the edge, put it near the top of my list. Moving on from there is the new Crobuzon trilogy by China Millville. And this is Perdido Street Station, The Scar, and Iron Council. And these, you know, China Millville is kind of credited as being like the first author to really usher in the wave of what's called new weird fiction. So this is new weird speculative fiction, steampunk kind of stories, and everyone says they're kind of a trip to read. And I really like new weird. You know, if you think Jeff Vandermeer, he's also on the vanguard of the new weird movement. So I'm hoping very much to read that. And then lastly, the last sci-fi series that is on my list to read is the Mad Adam trilogy by Margaret Atwood. This is Oryx and Crake, The Year of the Flood, and Mad Adam. This is dystopian speculative fiction. I think Margaret Atwood actually says she doesn't like calling it sci-fi because it doesn't have any kind of near supernatural advancements that most sci-fi has. So she calls it speculative fiction, but it's kind of clumped into the sci-fi category for me. And this is, again, dystopian future, a little bit grimdark, but always like a little bit of ray of optimism and hope mixed in. And so that is on my list. So my sci-fi series that I hope to read: The Wayfarers Quartet by Becky Chambers, Children of Time trilogy by Adrian Tchaikovsky, The Hyperion Quartet by Dan Simmons, The Captives War series by James S.A. Corey, the original Dune trilogy by Frank Herbert, The Passage trilogy by Justin Cronin, the new Crobuzon trilogy by China Millville, and the Mad Adam trilogy by Margaret Atwood. And now lastly, moving on to a series in the horror genre that I hope to read. Now, the first one is The Adversary Sextet by F. Paul Wilson. And I was just introduced to this by Greg from Another Bibliophile Reads. And this has a really interesting history. Originally, he published a trilogy, and then it was well received, and he published another trilogy, but you can't read them back to back. You have to mix up the order a little bit, and that was also well received. And he wrote, I think, another 24 books in the series. So in general, they say that the Adversary series is a sextet. Sometimes they add in one book from the others, so that makes it 7 books. Unlike many of the fantasy series I'm reading, these are all kind of not super chunky novels. These are all around the 300, 350 page. It's much easier to read 7 novels when they're 350 pages than when all of them are, you know, this big. But anyway, I don't anticipate reading the whole 36 novels in the series, but at least the original sextet, maybe the 7th book as well. And then Clown in a Cornfield trilogy by Adam Caesar. These are technically YA, but my impression is they're YA in the same way that a lot of Stephen King is YA, just given the subject matter and the way that they're told. This is basically small town slasher stories, so I'm excited about those. And I think there's actually a film of the first one either being made right now, and so it's always nice to read the books before the films come out, even though I don't really have time to watch films these days. But anyway, I would like to have the books under my belt before that is released. Now, moving on from there is The Wanderer's Duology by Chuck Wendig. And now, this is a duology, but both of the books, Wanderers and Wayward, are about more than 800 pages. So, for a horror story, that is quite chunky. Now, I've read a number of books by Chuck Wendig, most recently Black River Orchard and The Book of Accidents, and I loved both of those. And I also have an arc of a new novel he's written called Staircase in the Woods that comes out in April 2025. And so I really enjoy Chuck Wendig. And this series is about one day there's an epidemic of people who are essentially sleepwalking and in America, and they all are sleepwalking to some destination that only they know. And then in response to that, there's this hyper violent militia that rises up, and you are trying to find out the mystery of what has caused this to happen. And I think there's about a 5-year gap between the two books, so I'm really hoping to read those. I really do like Chuck Wendig. Moving on from that, I hope to read the Spectral Inspector trilogy by Cooper S. Beckett. Now, I first heard about this trilogy, which is Osgood is Gone, Osgood Riddance, and Osgood as She Gets by Ollie from CriminOlly. And he read these, I think, last year, maybe the year before, and he really enjoyed them as somewhat cozy, queer, paranormal investigating series. So that sounded really exciting to me, so I bought the books, and I just haven't had a chance to read them yet. So they're also on my list. Moving on is another series called The Exorcist's House. And now, this one, I don't know much about, except I see it going around. There are two books, The Exorcist's House and Exorcist's House Genesis. And the plot is simply that a psychologist and his family move into a farmhouse in 1994, and the house has a haunted legacy. And that is kind of all you need to know. And when it's called The Exorcist's House, you can kind of assume what that legacy might be. That takes place in 1994. The second book, Genesis, seems to have two timelines that take place in 1967 and 1997. So I'm excited to read those. My guess is there'll be a third book coming out soon. I'm also hoping to read The Rising series by Brian Keene. Just recently, I read a collection of short stories that were from the Rising universe that he wrote. It was just published this month, I think, and I really loved it. So The Rising is one of the books that really ushered in the new interest in zombies and in zombie literature. And his take on zombies is wildly different than most. It's not an infection. It isn't the undead. It has to do with essentially demons who are taking over people's bodies. And so his take on the zombie genre is different than anyone else, but it also is one of the series that really renewed interest in zombie fiction in general. So that has, I think, 3 novels, a novel and its sequel, and then a sidequel. And then there is another collection of short stories and a collection of novellas that are set in the same world as well. So at least those 3 novels I'm hoping to read, and the other ones we'll see. So moving on, the next one is actually a little bit uncommon. This is a middle grade trilogy. Now, I don't really read middle grade fiction in general, but I am doing my best to be an influence on my nibblings who are at the age when they're starting to read more. For Christmas this year, I just bought them the original 20 books from the original Goosebumps series, and this seems like a little bit step above that. So it's called the Blight Harbor Trilogy by Laura Senf. That's The Clackety, The Night Housekeeper, and The Loneliest Place. And the story is basically a girl must rescue her aunt, and she has to enter a world of witches and ghouls and demons and monsters in order to do that. I know Laura Senf this month is publishing a YA novel called The Losting Fountain, and it is like a fantasy horror novel. And I heard an interview with her on the Talking Scared podcast with Neil McRobert, and she was talking about this trilogy, and it just sounded really exciting. So even though I'm not particularly interested in middle grade horror myself, I do want to read it to see if it's something that I can share with my nibblings and with my family. And so I'm looking forward to that, actually. And I'd also say, if any of you enjoy reading horror novels, the Talking Scared podcast is really wonderful. It's all interviews with authors as they're publishing new books, and most of your favorite authors have probably had an interview with him, and it's really great to hear the authors in their own words. So I also recommend that. We're almost there. 2 more series. The next one is the Slaughter Trilogy by Sergio Gomez, and this is Camp Slaughter, Halloween Slaughter, and Final Slaughter, and basically college kids in a cabin in the woods and cannibals. And that is all I know and all I need to know to want to read this trilogy. And then lastly, the Wayward Pines trilogy by Blake Crouch. And this has been out for a while. There's even a TV series based on it, which I haven't seen. But I have read a few books by Blake Crouch, and not the ones he's most famous for. I just recently read Run, which is actually the first novel he wrote that he independently published. Now it is being republished by a major publisher. I think because he's gotten more popular, and I really enjoyed that. I thought it was really good, especially considering it was his first novel. And I've read Upgrade by him, And now I haven't read Recursion or Dark Matter or the other books that he's quite famous for, but the Wayward Pines trilogy sounds really exciting to me, and it is more on the horror side of sci-fi, and so I'm hoping to read those as well. So to recap, the horror series that I'm hoping to read, it is The Adversary Sextet by F. Paul Wilson, Clown in the Cornfield trilogy by Adam Caesar, The Wanderer's Duology by Chuck Wendig, the Spectral Inspector trilogy by Cooper S. Beckett, the Rising series by Brian Keene, the Exorcist House series by Nick Roberts, the Blight Harbor trilogy by Laura Senf, the Slaughter trilogy by Sergio Gomez, and the Wayward Pines trilogy by Blake Crouch. So you can see why I am overwhelmed. That's over 24 different series that I'm all hoping to read in 2025. I don't think there's any way I can read all of them, but I need to figure out a way to prioritize them. And so I would love your input. Which of these have you read? Which of these have you loved? Which of these have you not liked? Are you interested in buddy reading any of these? Are there series I missed? You know, if I already have 24, what hurts to add a few more to the pile? Now, most of the series I mentioned, I have either physical copies or digital copies of. So most of them I can start reading right away, but I would love to hear more ideas. I have no problem with a never-ending TBR. I know for some people, it freaks them out. For me, I like to have a list of books that I'm hoping to read, that if I'm in a slump or if I'm not really feeling everything I'm looking at, I like to have a big pile to pull from. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts about any of these series I mentioned, anything else you can think of. What are you hoping to read in 2025? Are there any series that you are really excited for? Please let me know down in the comments. I look forward to hearing from you. But for now, thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.